I'm very excited about our next guest. Lindsay Shepherd skyrocketed to international acclaim in 2017 when she was a 22-year-old graduate student at Laurier University. She did not have a public profile, but she was targeted by a diversity and inclusion woke mob because she dared to show a short clip of Jordan Peterson to her graduate students just to ask them what they thought. She was then harassed by the anti-harassers. There was an investigation of her, but she made a very strategic decision to record her own interrogation because, as we know, if she hadn't recorded it, no one would believe what they did to her. She turned the tables on her inquisitors and fought back. Her name is Lindsay Shepherd. The book is called Diversity and Exclusion, and we're delighted to interview her now. Lindsay, great to see you again. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. And thanks for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure. I'm so glad you wrote this book. I didn't know if you were able to tell the full story because I'm aware, and I'm delighted about this, that you are actually suing Wilfrid Laurier for blacklisting you, for deplatforming you, for smearing you in a trumped-up sham investigation. So is that lawsuit still going on?
Yeah, so that lawsuit was launched in 2018. And there's also a lawsuit in conjunction with Jordan Peterson. So he is suing for defamation because the professors that you were referring to that were in the disciplinary meeting with me, telling me I created a toxic environment and all that, they said Peterson was a charlatan and they compared him to Hitler. So he's suing for defamation concurrently. And so the lawsuit can't progress until Jordan Peterson is feeling a bit better. Your viewers may know he hasn't been of the greatest health lately. So because these lawsuits are all kind of combined, we're waiting for that point. Because I should add, the university, they're saying that if Jordan Peterson was indeed defamed, it would be my fault because I made a recording of the defamation. So there's a third-party claim against me, if that all makes sense.
I do understand it. I'm delighted, and you've got a very serious lawyer, if I'm not mistaken. Is Howard Levant still your lawyer?
Yeah, he's great.
He's one of the top legal minds in Canada, so this is not a rinky-dink lawsuit. If I were Wilfrid Laurier, and if I saw an incoming lawsuit from Howard Levant, I would be very worried. And I think one of the reasons they should be worried, and I don't want to talk about the lawsuit so much, but it is, it really covers what your book is about. You were put through a sham process, a fake trial, a show trial, like a struggle session that they would have in Maoist China. For example, you were told that there were one or more people who had complained about you, and there was all these complaints that were allegedly said, but it turned out it was all made up. It was just basically a chance to bait you and set you up. It would be what the Brits call a stitch up, am I right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's all documented in this book. So it was truly a pleasure to get all that out there.
I bet. Now, the book has been out for only about a week or so, and I see it's getting great ratings on Amazon, which is excellent. And I really look forward to digging into it myself. I feel like our side, and I don't know if you regard yourself on my side, but I regard myself on your side because I think you were victimized and demonized, and they shut down your ability to debate, and then they had a fake process, and then they smeared you. But the difference is you fought back and you made that one very smart decision. So I love the fact that you're fighting back. Is the book part of your fight back, or is it just to tell people this is what's going on campus? This is where you're sending your kids and grandkids. This is what you're spending 10, 20, 30 grand a year in university tuition for. This is what it's like these days.
Yeah, exactly. So it's mostly a memoir, but it has elements of a nonfiction book that is explaining what's going on campuses right now. But one of my main motivations was just to document everything that happened in that case from 2017 to 2018. I just saw a shortage of books that really serve as case studies of campus free speech issues. And so I thought this is a good chance to tell a full story especially because a lot of your viewers may have followed, the Laurier controversy when it was in the news in 2017. But, there was, even though at the end the university apologized and all that, there was still almost another full year of when I was still at school at Wilfrid Laurier University. And there was so much happening behind the scenes that wasn't necessarily newsworthy, but it's still really interesting. And it shows that gradual process of being alienated once you show to have, a different unpopular viewpoint on something. And so that story is now out there.
Am I correct to say that before this whole thing started, you weren't particularly a troublemaker? You weren't a public advocate. You weren't famous for campaigning or championing things. You were a grad student who was in an interesting debate. That this sort of forced you into the public eye. Is that true? That this turned you into an activist, or were you one to begin with?
No, as I write on the blurb of the book, I went from going from a nobody to going viral. So I had no social media accounts. I was not active in that kind of sphere at all. And this book tells the story of being thrust into those issues and learning about free speech and political correctness, those kinds of issues really quickly, and immersing myself in them because I just kind of found myself in the middle of something. And at a time when it was also very culturally relevant, which it kind of it still is. I mean, the pandemic has taken over the cultural relevancy, but it was just kind of the right moment where people were paying attention to things like gender pronouns and all that.
Yeah.
And I fell into it.
I think a lot of people are liberal or moderate, and then they get hit by this woke mob and they are either crumbled or they suddenly rediscover the importance of free speech, and they look around and they see that the woke mob is on the left. You tell me if I'm right or wrong here. I'm trying to think back to 2017, 2018, because we did cover these stories a little bit. I remember we sent a reporter out to Wilfrid Laurier, and if I recall, I think you were a little hesitant even to talk to Rebel News, because if I'm not mistaken, you probably would have described yourself as a liberal or at least regular. And back then, I think maybe you hadn't fully realized that the censors, the limiters of free speech, were increasingly from the left, and that it was conservatives that were on the free speechy side. I mean, I don't want to mischaracterize you, but that's how I sort of remember your transformation. You were a little nervous when we even said, "What's your story?" Because maybe you thought that the war against free speech was even on the right, as opposed to, I mean, I'm not saying there are no right-wingers who are against free speech, but I seem to recall you being a little bit liberal.
Yeah, I mean, I was a pretty, a person who kept to myself. And I think if you don't vocalize any kind of unorthodox opinions that you have, or you don't have any brush-ups with political correctness, you can kind of just go on thinking there's no problem. But I did brush up against it, and I very quickly learned that there was a problem. Otherwise, I think, people just go on thinking there's nothing wrong because they don't ever vocalize an unorthodox opinion. So you're right. I remember being hesitant to speak to, I think it was David Menzies at the free speech rally at Wilfrid Laurier, just because at the time I was being bombarded with accusations of, I'm alt-right and all these things. And I remember a professor at Laurier was writing how I'm going to end up working at Rebel News and they're the only ones who are going to hire me. I mean, this is the things that they say, right?
Well, it's funny because, I mean, I'm joking around, and this is not about us. It's just me remembering that you were blindsided by this. I think you were a regular person who was blindsided by this. And yeah, I mean, my question is really not about us. It's about how someone who's thrust into these cancel culture wars realizes that maybe the threat is surprisingly to them from the left. But let me ask you this. You talked about reputation, and they said only right-wingers will have you. You were smeared, and a student who's in grad school, I didn't go to grad school myself, I imagine that unless you're just really passionately interested in a subject and really, really, really want to learn more about it, there is sort of a hope that you would get a job in academia. I think that's what graduate school is about, right? So if you are blackened, blacklisted, blackballed by academic bosses, by deans and professors as being a troublemaker at best and like a transphobe or whatever at worst, you're not going to get offers to be an assistant professor somewhere or whatever the next ladder on the next rung on the academic ladder is, right? So they really killed any academic career you could have had.
Yeah, you're right. And the world of Canadian academia, the arts, it's really quite small. And even if you do have some professors advocating for you, which I did, there were some, pro free speech professors across the country who were openly supporting me. Still, to get hired in an academia today, you have to sit through these, you have like a panel of people interviewing you. And their main concern right now is do you abide by the tenets of diversity and inclusion? And what I did, which is say that Jordan Peterson's view on compelled speech and pronouns was a valid viewpoint, I'm seen as antithetical to their mandate of diversity and inclusion. So that's kind of, that's why I'm a fan of the title of my book, Diversity and Exclusion.
Yeah. Well, every kind of diversity is allowed except for diversity of thought. Everyone's included except for those they cancel and they exclude. I think it's a great title also. You make me think of Peter Thiel, the great tech entrepreneur, libertarian thinker. He is famous for a job interview question that he would put to people. And I don't know if you've ever heard it, but I've got it on my screen here. It's, what important truth do very few people agree with you on? Or another way of saying that is, what is a heretical view that you have? And he liked to ask that, not so much because he wanted to know the particular answer, but he wanted to know if you could answer that question, if there's anything in your life you've ever done to be a dissenter, a disruptor, because most people would say, I have never been a heretic, I've never dissented, I've never made a ripple or a wave. Please don't call me an outsider. That's what I love about the question. I don't even think he really cared what the answer was. He just wanted to know, do you have the courage to swim against the current? What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's awesome. And I really learned throughout the controversy that I like being around people who have, been through controversies themselves, who have had false accusations or anonymous complaints put against them, because you do gain a certain understanding of the world once you've been put through that. Whereas I think people who haven't rubbed up against it, they don't have that insight.
We're talking with Lindsay Shepherd, of course, the hero of Laurier University, who stood up to the woke mob, very strategically recorded their sham investigation of her. Her new book is called Diversity and Exclusion, Confronting the Campus Free Speech Crisis. We'll have a link to it under this video. Well, let me put the Thiel question to you, and maybe I know the answer. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
Well, so there's one part in my book where I talk about who I was before the Laurier controversy. And I say that, let's say I had been approached on the street, and kind of like what the Rebel does sometimes, like streeters approaching random people. And if you had asked me, are trans women women? I probably just would have said, yeah, sure, whatever. And now, after having learned about those issues, I would say, no, that's not correct. Trans women are trans women. And I'm not sure if that's an unpopular opinion or a popular opinion. But I think a lot of people are just too scared of being perceived as mean. That's probably where my previous view is coming from.
Yeah, you didn't want to be mean.
Yep.
And that's a nice place to come from, to be nice to everybody. Not to be mean to everybody, but often, that may be the intention, but the outcome, in the case of trans women, for example, okay, have you just destroyed all girls sports, for example, because now trans women can compete with women. I think that's a very interesting answer to the Peter Thiel question, because I don't know. I think most people would say trans women are real women just to avoid being mobbed, but secretly in their heart they would say the opposite. I mean, they would hold two different views, one for public consumption, one for private consumption. Like in the former Soviet Union, you knew what to say to people you didn't know and trust, and then you knew what you could say at home within the privacy of your own house. Let me ask you this. Your story, I mean, it was well covered in the National Post, and we did our best to cover it too, and you were a great spokesperson yourself. I'm glad you've lawyered up, and I understand why the lawsuit sort of paused. This book is an excellent expression of all these things. But what is your proposal or plan? If you had one piece of advice for how to fix things, what would it be?
Yeah, in my book, I say straight up that we need to close all diversity and inclusion offices at universities. And that's going to be what I see as the most important step to making universities bastions of free thought again. Because those offices, while they sound nice, you want to include everyone, inclusion, what they are really in the business of is enforcing ideological conformity and making sure everyone on campus has the correct viewpoints on everything. That's what they're doing. And they get six-figure salaries, the heads of these offices, and the students pay for it. And it's just so ridiculous. They need to all be shut down. So that's my suggestion.
I think that's spot on. How likely is that to happen? Is there any school in the country that doesn't have one of these offices? I mean, I'm sure even community colleges where they would teach something more, practical to a different type of student. Like there's some universities that are so abstract in the humanities and, peace and gender studies, vegetarian studies, whatever. But I bet even in trade schools where you're learning how to, get your welding ticket, they probably have these offices. Is there any chance of pulling out this weed by the root in the liberal arts universities? Because to me, that sounds like such a impossible prescription. I agree with you, we need to do that, but really, is that even possible these days?
I mean, these offices are only expanding. They're expanding into the private sector too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not every university has a diversity office. It's only if you have enough money, frankly. The smaller universities just kind of have a web page saying how they abide by the tenets of diversity and inclusion. But once they get enough funding, they open one often. I think it's only the University of Prince Edward Island where I think they had to shut it down for lack of funding, like many, many years ago, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, they're only expanding. I think students who do arts degrees, they see, or even business, or STEM, because, there's this whole women in STEM, BIPOC STEM kind of stuff.
So you're using lingo, STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, and math, I think, and BIPOC, that's, what does that stand for? Black, Indigenous, people of color. It's this whole language and vocabulary I don't think most people know what BIPOC means on the street, but there's this whole language and like an insider speak. And if you don't, I often think about this. It used to be the word Indian, the Indian Act and Indian Reserve. These are legal words, status Indian, Indian agent. But then that was racist, so it became Aboriginal. Then it became First Nations, then it became Indigenous. And if you're not keeping up with the latest phrase, you are obviously racist. Even if you're not, I think they have to continuously ratchet things forward to show that they are one step ahead of you so they can sneer at you, investigate you, punish you. I think it's mission creep. And, I think the whole trans movement is mission creep. You have complete equality under the law for gay people, gay marriage, gay adoption. It's all, every single box in their to-do list is checked. So to justify the perpetual campaign, they move to trans issues. That's my thinking. What do you think?
Yeah, well, even what you're saying about the evolution of the word that we now say Indigenous, if you write it down, you have to capitalize the I. Same with the word black, you have to capitalize the B in black in order to be proper. And so it's like what you're saying. But I see it more as you have to keep up with these trends and show that you're very in the know, show that you're paying attention to social justice issues. And I think social justice is very infectious in a bad way. And I mean, it's kind of like a cancer. But I still am kind of in the know about those terms. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but when someone says, for example, like I had a boss once who called someone an Oriental gentleman, just in reference to an Asian person. And yeah, if a woke person heard that, they'd think, oh, that's racist language. But really what it is, it's someone from a different generation, it's someone older, and that's the language they're used to, and they're not keeping up with social justice language. That's all it is.
Yeah, and I think it's constant attempts to show you're more virtuous than the next guy. It's like, oh, you're only wearing one mask? I'm wearing two masks. What are you, some grandma killer? Oh, you're a two-masker? Well, me and the three-mask kids are better than you. I think it's this arms race of whoever can be 1 degree more woke than the next guy, completely disconnected from reality. I mean, I know this word, I don't even know how to say it, Latin X. Some people say Latinx. I think it's Latin X. It's a way of saying Latino and Latina. And I've seen polls showing that like 90% of Latinos hate that phrase. It's basically used by white liberal academics to create some new class of diversity. It's just an industry unto itself. It reminds me of the old human rights commissions that I used to fight with. Their mandate is to find hate. So even if they're in a peaceful, happy society, they have to find hate to justify their budgets, justify their jobs, justify their moral authority. So they will find it whether it exists or not. I think that these diversity and exclusion committees, they will find racism whether it exists or not, just so they can justify their whole worldview and their job.
Oh, exactly. There's one part in the book where I describe, there's kind of a whole backstory, but in short, there were posters around campus that said, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, Migrant Lives Matter, all of these lives matter, right? Mm-hmm. And there was one poster where someone had penned White Lives Matter, in addition to all the other lives, because White Lives Matter, they were not on the original poster. And a student ripped that poster down and took it to the diversity office and said it was racism.
Well, and I'm sure they thought it was. Listen, yeah. It's great that you've got this book out. I look forward to digging into it. I would encourage our viewers to read it. The book is called Diversity and Exclusion, Confronting the Campus Free Speech Crisis. We'll have a link to the Amazon page below this video. I want to read it because it's very interesting, and you are the pointing edge of the spear in this fight. But more than that, anyone who writes a book that dissents from the woke mindset, I think it behooves us to buy that book just out of moral support. I want to buy it to read it, but I think we have to buy it to support it, not just to support you, but also to show the world that there is a demand for the conservative point of view. And I want your book to become the #1 bestseller on Amazon so the whole world knows that there is another side of the story and that there's a public interest in it. And maybe that Peter Thiel question that you answered, maybe the emperor has no clothes, and the number of people who are willing to say the woke narrative is actually smaller than the number who secretly know the truth. I don't know. I think it's a very important book, and I'm delighted to have you on the show for it today. So thank you, and good luck to you.
Thanks so much, Ezra.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.